Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wondered if you are the boss of your own brain, or if there are hidden forces directing your thoughts and actions? This new study dives deep into exactly that question. Imagine learning something without even realizing it. That is the core idea we're exploring today. For ages, scientists have debated whether we can learn complex rules and patterns without ever becoming consciously aware of them. This debate has been superheated, especially when it comes to a task called artificial grammar learning, or AGL. In AGL, people are shown a bunch of letter sequences, kind of like made-up words that follow a secret grammatical rule. Most people can then pick out new sequences that follow the rule, even if they can't explain the rule itself. They often say they're just guessing or have a gut feeling. This has convinced many researchers that learning in AGL is mostly unconscious. But then, some studies came along that challenged this idea. They found that people could identify specific pairs of letters, called Bigrams, that made the sequences grammatical. The big question became, does knowing these letter pairs automatically mean you are consciously aware of the grammar? Today's study tackles this head-on. Think about how much of what we do might be on autopilot. We drive, we walk, we talk, and often we don't consciously think about every single step or word. Psychologists want to know if this unconscious learning is truly happening, especially for more complex things. It is like asking if our brain can build up sophisticated knowledge without our conscious mind being involved at all. Arthur Reber, a pioneer in this field, first showed this with his AGL experiments back in the 1960s. Participants would memorize strings of letters generated by a hidden grammar. Later, they'd be asked to judge if new strings were grammatical or not. Typically, they did a lot better than chance, proving they'd learned something. But, crucially, when asked what they'd learned, they were often stumped. They might say they were just guessing or had a good feeling about some strings. However, a major turning point came with studies like Dulani, Carlson, and Dewey in the 1980s. They asked participants not just to judge grammaticality, but also to point out the specific chunks of letters that made a string grammatical. Participants were surprisingly good at this. This led to the argument that maybe people did have conscious knowledge of these chunks, like Bigrams, and that is why they could perform the task so well. Peruche and Pacto later reinforced this by showing that knowledge of specific Bigrams could explain performance in standard AGL tasks. These findings cast doubt on the idea of truly unconscious learning in AGL. The researchers behind this paper asked a crucial question: do our subjective feelings about our knowledge always match reality? They designed a clever experiment to find out. They created brand new artificial grammars specifically built so that the only useful information for judging grammaticality was the sequence of two letters. The Bigrams, they made sure there were no other tricks in the grammar, like patterns of repeating letters or more complex structural rules that people could unconsciously latch onto this way. Any learning observed had to be about Bigrams. To make sure their findings weren't just a fluke and to see if it applied to different kinds of information, they ran the experiment in two conditions, one with regular letters and another with sequences of facial expressions. They thought that maybe faces being more social and potentially processed differently might show a stronger implicit learning effect. So, participants in both groups first memorized strings of letters or faces made by the secret grammar. Then, in the test phase, they were shown new strings and had to decide if each was grammatical or not. But here is the key part: after every decision, they had to report on their subjective awareness. They were asked if their decision was based on a conscious memory or rule, a vague feeling they couldn't explain, or a pure guess. This trial-by-trial reporting and the careful design to isolate Bigram knowledge were designed to directly test the assumption that Bigram knowledge must be conscious. Their main hope was to show that people could learn these Bigram rules unconsciously, even if they felt like they were just guessing. They predicted that in the latter condition, participants would perform above chance on unconscious trials. They also expected some conscious learning, but they thought the unconscious part would be the real test of their hypothesis. For the faces condition, they expected to see an even stronger unconscious learning effect, based on prior research. They recruited a good number of participants, 188 in total, and were very strict about data quality, filtering out anyone who couldn't follow instructions. They used a clever design where participants were randomly assigned to either the letter or face condition and then exposed to one of two different grammars during the learning phase. In the testing phase, they had to classify strings from both grammars. This crossover design helps to cancel out any biases related to a specific grammar. Here is a peek at the grammars they used. They look a bit like flowcharts. Strings were generated by following the arrows. The important thing is that these grammars were specifically built with Bigrams in mind. During the learning phase, participants were simply told to memorize the strings. no mention of a grammar. Then came the test phase. After each classification, and this is crucial, they had to rate their conscious awareness. They were given clear definitions for guess intuition, familiarity, which they grouped as implicit or unconscious knowledge versus rules, and remembering, which they considered explicit or conscious knowledge. They were even told to call something conscious if they had even a fragment of a rule in mind. This was to make sure they weren't underreporting conscious knowledge, and to truly test the limits of unconscious learning. They had a rigorous comprehension check to make sure everyone understood these awareness ratings. The way they constructed the grammars was really meticulous. They ensured that the two grammars shared no bigrams, which is important. They also avoided adjacent repeating letters to prevent processing fluency from confusing their results. They even carefully balanced the frequency of each bigram and letter across all positions in the strings to avoid certain biases and the anchor effect, where people might focus too much on the beginning or end of a string. For the letters condition, they used a few simple characters, N, K, V, P, T, Z. For the faces condition, they used facial expressions of anger, fear, disgust, neutrality, sadness, and happiness presented by the same actor. They chose this actor and conditions carefully, based on previous research showing how social stimuli can influence learning. Now for the results, they used a combination of statistical tests, including something called Generalized Linear Mixed Models or GLMS and Bayesian analysis. Don't worry about the technical terms. The main idea is they used powerful tools to see if the patterns they found were real or just due to random chance. They were specifically looking for performance above what you'd expect from pure guessing. First, the letters condition. They found compelling evidence that participants learned the grammars to the letter. Their overall accuracy was significantly above chance, with an estimated accuracy of around 64%. The Bayesian analysis gave them extremely strong evidence for this learning. But here's the clincher. When they looked at the awareness reports, they found significant implicit learning. Participants attributed about 57% of their responses to unconscious strategies, like guessing or familiarity, and their accuracy on these self-reported unconscious trials was around 61.77. This is well above chance. The Bayes factor. A measure of evidence was enormous, meaning there is extremely strong support for unconscious learning of bigrams in the letter condition. They also found explicit learning, meaning when people felt they were consciously applying rules, they were also accurate, around 64.5%. This is great, but the main point for this study is the significant implicit learning that occurred even when they reported relying on unconscious knowledge. This graph visually shows it. Both conscious and unconscious decisions led to above-chance accuracy in the letters condition. Now, what about the faces? This is where things got a bit unexpected. In the faces condition, the overall learning effect was much weaker. The accuracy was only around 53%, barely above chance. The evidence for learning here was only anecdotal according to their statistical tests. And when they broke it down by awareness, they didn't find significant implicit learning. Participants reported relying on unconscious strategies for about 65% of their responses, but their accuracy in this category was only about 52.3%, which is essentially chance. The statistical evidence here actually favored the idea that there was no real unconscious learning. They did find some hint of explicit learning with faces, around 53.9% accuracy. But again, it was not statistically strong. This graph for the faces condition shows that the lines are pretty flat, indicating performance close to chance, whether people reported conscious or unconscious strategies. Interestingly, they found a significant difference in the proportion of conscious versus unconscious reports between the two conditions. Participants reported relying on unconscious strategies much more often when dealing with faces, 67.3% compared to letters, 53%. This suggests that faces might indeed encourage more of an autopilot mode, and importantly, overall accuracy was much higher for letters, 62.8%, than for faces, 51.8%. This strongly suggests that while people might use unconscious strategies with faces, those strategies aren't as effective for learning the grammar compared to letters. So what does all of this mean? The big takeaway from this study is that in the letters condition, they found robust evidence of unconscious bigram learning. This directly challenges the long-held idea that knowing specific chunks like letter pairs must mean you are consciously aware of them. The researchers were very careful in their design and analysis to rule out alternative explanation. Their results align with other subtle findings, like an unpublished study by Zoltan Dines, suggesting that identifying grammatical chunks doesn't automatically equate to conscious knowledge. This research supports the idea that our brains can build up knowledge of simple patterns, like bigrams. even without us being aware of it. This is consistent with theories like global workspace theory, which suggests that simpler, more automatic processing might not always reach full conscious awareness. The unexpected finding was the lack of a clear unconscious learning effect with faces. The researchers suggest that the grammars they designed, while excellent for isolating Bigram learning, might have been too difficult for the face stimuli. Faces are more complex to process than letters, and perhaps participants defaulted to learning other, more superficial features, like repeating patterns, rather than the underlying Bigram grammar. This highlights a really interesting point. The type of information we learn might depend on the stimuli itself. We might learn Bigrams for simple patterns like letters, but perhaps different kinds of structures for more complex stimuli like faces. So, to wrap up, this study makes a strong case that we can indeed learn simple rules like Bigram sequences unconsciously, especially with stimuli like letters. This means that just because someone can identify a pattern doesn't mean they're consciously aware of how they're doing it. It suggests that a significant part of our learning and behavior might be happening beneath the surface of our awareness, something we've suspected but is now more strongly supported by this research. The fact that faces didn't show the same effect tells us that when it comes to learning, different types of information might engage different cognitive processes. It is not a one-size-fits-all situation. Future research could explore what kinds of patterns people learn with faces, and if different learning strategies emerge with more complex stimuli. This research has real implications for how we think about learning, education, and even how we understand our own minds. It reminds us that there is often more going on in our brains than we consciously realize. What do you all think? Does this make sense with your own experiences? Let me know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this dive into the unconscious mind, be sure to like this video, subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration into the fascinating world of psychology. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.